Welcome back to RE Radar, the podcast where we cut through the noise on America's biggest asset, your home. Now, once again, I'm your host and realtor, Nathan Matheson. And today, what is on the docket is we're going to be doing a little something different. Not quite the same. We're not doing the usual predictions or the market update. Instead, what I'm going to be doing on today's episode is proving with data why real estate headlines so often get the market wrong. Because here's the pattern of what I'm seeing consistently in the news. A dramatic headline, it grabs your attention, but the data, the actual story, is buried underneath, and it might tell a much calmer or a much different story than what that headline is painting. Now, today, what I'm doing is I've picked out 5 real headlines, and for each one, we'll read the headline exactly as written and then compare it to the actual numbers behind it and inside the story to see what's wrong with the headline, or maybe the headline's good. So it's not opinions, it's not vibes, it's just context. Alrighty, first headline that we are going to be going after is U.S. housing market poised to crash worse than 2008, expert warns, and 50% plunge could start in 2026. Protect yourself. First of all, that's not a headline, that's a gosh dang paragraph. But back to the main point, and where this headline is from Yahoo Finance. Now, this headline, looking at it's good in that it does exactly what it's designed to do. Well, it triggers memory because 2008 wasn't just a housing downturn, it was a financial systematic failure. So, invoking that term in real estate, it immediately frames today's market as catastrophic. Now, let's look at the numbers that aren't inside the headline itself to see what's the picture they're trying to paint. Well, in 2008, unemployment, it peaked at above 10%. Foreclosure filings exceeded 2.8 million per year. Mortgage lending included widespread no-doc and subprime loans. Home prices fell roughly 20 to 30% nationally. Now compare what we saw in 2008's economy to today's economy. Unemployment is roughly 4%. Foreclosures are down year over year, not up. Over 90% of mortgages are fixed rate. Roughly 60 to 70% of homeowners have rates under 4%. Now, that's not some fragile owner base that is about to be selling their home for way below current market value. There's not some massive crash coming with those homeowners. Yes, affordability is stretched. Median home price in the US is around $410,000. Well, in Seattle here, we're at what, 800, 900,000? Now, incomes overall in the United States, they haven't kept pace with the home prices increasing. And that's the real issue. But affordability stress is not the same thing as a systematic collapse like that article headline might have you thinking. So what this headline does is it invokes fear. It takes long-term affordability discussion and reframes it as an imminent market crash. The better question to be asking and discussing is whether a few overheated markets are cooling off or whether the data actually is supporting a nationwide downturn. This way, you frame it logistically and simply put it out there to anyone to easily understand the discussion. Because really, this housing market the US is in, it's all about an affordability issue right now, along with, in some different areas, supply and demand issues then in terms of supply not matching demand, which then, of course, brings up the prices everywhere. So that was the first headline. All right, next headline is from the World Property Journal. US housing market hits a turning point. Over half of US homes lose value in 2025. This one sounds definitive. Over half, nationwide, done deal. Picture this. You're here midway through your turkey leftovers late at night and your phone buzzes with the headline, over half homes lose value in a single year. That's the kind of line that would have you Googling reverse mortgages at 2 a.m. and completely just panicking because what the heck? That's crazy. Half the value. And what this piece does is it leans hard on Zillow's 2025 home price report, claiming a national turning point where more than 50% of US homes will dip in value. And it's framed as the big pivot from the boom to bust. Now, there's no granular stats in the article itself, just that ominous over half hook, painting a market that is teetering on collapse. So alarm bells, well, more like air raid sirens would be going off to people who just read that headline and don't really look into it anymore. Now, the headline is not backed up with data at all, as if you do pull the full Zillow data, what that shows is, well, 70% of the top 50 markets saw gains or stability in the quarter four here of 2025, with the national median value up 1.8% year to date. So what's happening in some markets? Well, they're seeing slight dips, and it's really just the post-bubble normalization, as when you get these different markets where for 3 straight years or for a small amount of time, there are these 10% jumps of value consistently year after year. Obviously, some of those markets have to come back to a more realistic area. Now, inventory is climbing 15% nationally, and that is easing pressure for buyers a little bit. And then new construction is at 1.4 million units, up 5% from 2024. So all good things. So what the heck is this article's angle? Well, it preys on the FOMO regret, making owners check Zillow obsessively and buyers just bail on going out buying a home because they're like, why would I buy a home when market's about to crash crazy? So it's all just preying on that, when the truth is really values, they fluctuate. 2025 is more of a rebalancing, recentering, not a rout of a market. So if your zip code did dip, well, congratulations. You're now a more buyer-friendly market and can help real estate in that way. So here's some more of the missing context. Well, Zillow tracks metro by metro changes, and many of the declines that they saw, well, they were more just single-digit pullbacks. Most of them then occurred in those markets that, as we touched on earlier, rose 20 to even in some extreme cases, 40% between 2020 and 2022. So obviously those markets have to cool back off a bit because that was just too meteoric of a rise. Nationally, median home prices, they are, as we touched on, flat to slightly up year to date, 1 to 2% in the nation. Roughly 70% of the top 50 metros saw prices that held steady or increased in the second half of the year. This is all normalization, not destruction. This is not some mass panic button of they're going to lose 50% of the value now this upcoming year. So if the market goes up 30%, it gives back 5 to 8%. Headlines are calling it some massive loss. Well, those homeowners, they still have huge equity. They still have a 20-25% of equity built up there since they purchased. So what this headline does is it compresses dozens of local trends into one scary sentence. The better question that you should be thinking about and asking is this a correction from excess or a single of a long-term decline? Which, in my opinion, and what we've touched on statistically and talked about on RE Radar a lot, is this is more of just a correction period from the excess mass huge boost that happened after the COVID low rates came in, real estate prices through the roof. So now this is more of a correction on that, in my opinion. Alrighty, headline number 3 out of the Economic Times. Only 2.8% of homes sold. America's housing market is in a deep freeze. Well, this stat is technically accurate, but in my opinion, it's pretty wildly misleading. When you read that tiny percentage, it screams, oh gosh, nobody's moving. Backed up then in the article by a rant on 6 to 7% rates, locking in place the people who have that lower rate, which, as we've touched on, is 60 to 70% of the country. Inventory droughts, even though it is up, people still talk about that. Well, then you've got the phrases like the market gridlock, standstill, domino effect on the economy. It's all just that classic scary dystopian novel stuff. And in the article, they tie this to slowed construction and job woes, omitting any nod to actual sales number. Pure freeze frame fear right there. Just bad stuff. That 2.8% figure, what it actually is an annualized turnover rate, not even an actual sales total. Specifically, it's Redfin's annualized turnover rate through September. And what they saw was just 28 homes per 1,000 were flipping, which, that is per se low. It's the lowest in decades, but it's really not the whole story. Just a little more context: with 147 million housing units today versus 110 million in the 90s, that same 3.1 million year-to-date sale is going to obviously look a little worse percentage-wise than back then. Now, really the thing I want to harp on, though, is the idea of 2.8%. How low is that really? They just give that number out there. What are most years at 7%, 8%, 10%? And that's where I think they're really hiding this in that, 2023, that annualized turnover rate was 3.55%. 2021, there was a big boom with the low interest rates, and that was seen as, I want to say, like the highest of all time, and that was 4.36%. From 2010 to 2020, saw a low of 3.18% and a high of 4.04%. So if you really think about it, 2.8%, it's lower, but it's not crazy lower. I mean, at a couple of those years, it's like 0.3, 0.4% lower than what is seen as kind of standard or average over the last decade. So really 2.8% is lower, but I don't see any reason why it should be some big panic. So this article is more of misleading. It's not a lie, but starting with that headline is going to instantly cause people to get scared. And we all know in today's society, most people, they're probably only reading that headline. So when they don't get the whole more accurate story, they just go in there believing, oh gosh, this housing market is looking horrible, nobody's selling. And again, look at it, of course, less people are selling their homes in 2025, 2024, as what is the stat we've been touching on a lot this episode so far? 60 to 70% of mortgages are lower than 5%. But shoot, it's not like the market is collapsing and nobody is buying houses. It's simply, why would these folks want to sell? There still is demand. It's just a matter of a lot of folks are locked into these low rates and they don't want to sell and they shouldn't sell. But if you do look at it, there is still demand, as pending sales are up year over year here. Essentially, this headline is kind of framing a supply problem as a demand collapse, which just isn't true. A better question, of course, would be to ask, is the market frozen or just constrained? And it's just a little constrained right now, in my opinion. Now, headline number 4 is from the New York Post. Alarming number of homes pulled from the market. See which U.S. city fared the worst. Now, this headline leans hard on the word of alarming. Obviously, alarming, that's going to get people looking and get people a little cautious. Yes, delistings have increased. Roughly 85,000 homes pulled nationally in a single month, up about 28% year over year, and the highest in a decade. Virginia Beach, they take the crown with 74.5% delistings and had 70% of listings lingering for 60 plus days in Virginia Beach. But let's look to try to find the actual reason for this occurrence. And really, in my opinion, it often comes down to some of those stubborn sellers who won't budge on their prices amid rates that might have some buyers a little harder to afford these homes. So sellers, they rent it out or they bail on this home because they don't get that big price that they are hoping for, even though the market obviously is not supporting that larger price that they're listing these homes at. Miami is another bad one with 57 delistings per 100 new ones. So the Post paints it as turbulence, keeping supply tight, prices high, and buyers sidelined. It's stark, it's dramatic, and it's alarming. Check, 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 they say. Again, they're not lying. It's not lying. These articles, they're not lying. They're just zoomed in on the extremes. National inventory, what are we touching on? It's up 15% year over year per Realtor.com. Active listings, they're climbing in 80% of metros. Delistings, they hurt. But often it could be as sellers testing the waters, and then they retreat when it's not getting that price that they are needing in order to be willing to sell. So it could also be more of a strategy, sellers just throwing their home out there, hoping it sells for that high price, but then taking it off the market when no takers come. This isn't really a collapse. It's really just comes down to a pricing standoff with sellers who maybe they purchased their home in 2021. Well, if you purchased your home in 2021, Obviously, when you sell your home, nobody wants to sell at a loss. Well, in 2021, most people overpaid for their house. You had to bid up on those homes. You had to go $150,000, $200,000 over list price. So if you do that, well, obviously, the value in 2025 is not going to support that number that you purchased it at 2021. So you're going to have to list it at a loss, basically. Or what a lot of sellers do is, well, they overprice it. They list it too high. And then obviously, eventually, those listings all end up being taken off the market. Maybe they then get rented out. Maybe the seller decides to just stay there, or it comes back onto the market later at a much lower price, much more reasonable price, and can actually sell then. So the better question here to ask, in my opinion, is, are sellers under pressure, or are buyers just no longer rushing every decision? Buyers kind of have a little more say, a little more power in the housing market, which is good. A more even, fair market. Alrighty, last headline for you guys is from the New York Times, and it is a global housing bubble about to burst? Now, this article is a pretty generalized one, with it talking about the global housing bubble. But then, of course, when you actually read the article, or I should say, if you actually read the article, you learn that it's more of a certain city issue, not all of the US cities. Most cities in the US are at a low risk, and that's what they tell you in the article. Now, then, of course, some cities, well, they're at a slightly more susceptible, higher risk. One of those more susceptible cities is one we have touched on from other articles, and that's Miami, which it does have an increasing amount of vacancies. But overall, the US is quite unlikely to face any type of mass real estate collapse. The more important question people should be asking here and discussing is just what areas of the US real estate market are perhaps weakening versus chugging along just fine. Now, here's my overall takeaway from these headlines and reading these headlines and then reading the article. Headlines, what they are, they aren't designed to help you make a $700,000 decision that is buying a home. They're designed to make you click. The danger isn't that they're false, it's that they're just incomplete. They're not the full story. So if you slow down, zoom out, ask better questions, the market is going to look far less terrifying and far more navigable than a lot of these headlines are portraying it as again, headlines are just meant to attract people to click on this article and they make money then. I'm Nathan Matheson, and this has been RE Radar. Once again, if you do ever have any personal questions about your situation, feel free to reach out, and of course, I'm happy to help answer those questions for you. But until then, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Have a good one. Peace.